off with a little analogy around oatmeal cookies, and then I think that will help us frame our conversation today. So, once upon a time, a long time ago, there was only one way we thought to make oatmeal cookies, and that was with raisins. And everybody who learned about oatmeal cookies made them with raisins. And then, somewhere along the way, someone came and said, "Do you know what these cookies are missing? Chocolate chips." And everyone was like, "Oh my goodness, yes, chocolate chips are exactly what we need in these cookies." And we got so excited about the chocolate chips that we started to forget to put in the raisins. And now we're in a place where someone has come along and said, these cookies are missing something. And I think the missing ingredient is the raisins. And we need to be very careful as teachers and cookie makers that we don't turn all the way to the raisins and forget to put in the chocolate chips that we have come to use and rely on in our wonderful cookie recipe. And so I think that where we're at right now in reading instruction and understanding how kiddos learn to read is that we need both raisins and chocolate chips. And we might need more raisins or more chocolate chips depending on the time that we're making those cookies. And each kiddo might need more raisins or more chocolate chips in their cookies in order to have the right recipe for them to figure out how to read. And so, not to start a cookie war over chocolate chips versus raisins in the oatmeal cookie, because that is a hotly debatable topic. But using that analogy, what are you noticing around this movement? We could say that has many titles: structured literacy, science of reading versus balanced literacy versus whatever buzzword you want to throw on that. Mary Lou, do you want to start us off a little bit about this almost like a push and pull and some of those dangers we might be facing as we see something coming up that feels new or feels overwhelming in relation to teaching reading?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to just refer to your cookie analogy, which I do love, and we want that ability to have that nice, to be able to choose and to be able to add things in, but we don't want to make it so that that cookie recipe doesn't have the recipe anymore. And we want to make sure that we don't, substitute just so many things that it doesn't even resemble an oatmeal cookie recipe. And I think that sometimes out there for educators, for students, there's been an interpretation, and interpreting is fabulous, but there are limits. And when things get interpreted and then reinterpreted and interpreted, sometimes things can get lost. And then how do you get back to that original recipe? And so I think sometimes that's where we're at this point, and we need to possibly go back to that structure, go back to that beginning recipe, and really analyze it and say, okay, now this is great. And if adding the raisins in, everybody's with me, I can add some chocolate chips and maybe even nuts too, and I can go a little bit further, right? And so I really think that if we can perhaps find our way through some of this massive amount of change that's come. We've had a lot of information coming our way. We've had a lot of different ways of doing things, like you had mentioned, that list of balanced literacy, etc. How to find our way. And I think that a systematic and explicit approach is a starting point. And I think that leads to effective teaching. And students are looking for boundaries. They're looking for that kind of system. And I just want to point out that something systematic and explicit does not have to be boring. It can be quite exciting. But what we're doing is we're alleviating that cognitive load for students by keeping the system in place and changing the contents. And you're doing that with your cookie as well. So you just take those lessons and you put new content in there, but the students know where they're going. They have a roadmap, and their energies can go into the content and learn that content rather than, and particularly in my context, which is often second or third line plurilingualism in Alberta's immersion French second language francophone classrooms who also have multilingual learners. We have this you know added element of trying to follow instruction in the classroom. So the more systematic the work can be, changing the content, the greater ability it is for the students to focus on the content and learn that content.
I totally agree. And as you're talking about changing the recipe, I think about I don't know if you ever look online for recipes, but then you read the comments below, and people are like, "This recipe was great," and then they listed all the things they changed in the recipe, and I always think like, "But then you didn't make that thing anymore. You made a whole new thing." So why like of course it was great, you invented something new. And so I think that you're right, it's really helpful when we can build some routines or structures. And I think the other piece that is super helpful is understanding the intentionality of the role of the teacher in crafting that movement through the structures and routines. And so, um, you know, when we've got those routines in place or the system is in place, then it's our job as the professional to be making the decisions about what comes next. What do I need to revisit? How does this connect to something else that we're studying?
and
Len,
and and just like a great writer, you have to learn the rules of writing, and then you can break them. And so I think some of the same goes for this. Once we learn a structure, and when the students learn the structure they're in, they're not tied to that. It's not like they can't soar. They can soar. There's room for that. But we just need to know that certain elements are in place and understood.
Lana, do you want to speak briefly to this? Just the really the system of phonological awareness and why that matters to
Mhm.
beginner readers.
Mhm. Well, and I think right now, Charlie, we're at a time where we can uh, take time to reflect on the practices that we've been using, because we've been in a bit of a time where we've been forced, I guess, to change. And so it's a great time to look at what has been working and what has not been working. So when we talk phonological awareness, we know that the oral conversation and those communication pieces are really, really key. So when we think of how we learned and how students will learn to speak and then eventually be able to read and then be able to write, those pre kind of phonological pieces are key in what we're doing in classrooms. And it revolves around all of that listening and speaking, evolving, I guess, from the phonemes that we're hearing in our classrooms, right? So the structure and the routine and sort of the boundaries that we set in our classroom and how we actually instruct these skills is really, really important. So I think the time that we're just coming off of has given us an opportunity to really look at our practices, what's working, what's not working, what have kids got, and what I guess are the gaps now. And so I think the way that we can close some of those gaps is with that systematic kind of scope and sequence, very routine in a boundary of really looking at phonological awareness and what's part of it. So,
I think it's really interesting because something that's kind of come into my own mind as I've talked to other parents and teachers that have experienced, a global pandemic alongside of us, um, is how much oral language was incidental in our classrooms and in our playground experiences or playgroup experiences or bumping into somebody on the street and having a conversation. And in light of recent events for the past 2 years, that there's been a reduction in that, both participating in oral language and listening to oral language, because we're not necessarily having those small talk in the grocery stores, or meet up with somebody at the park and we're having a conversation with them because we were, staying 6 feet apart at least. um, and so for me to realize how much oral language just happened, and we didn't plan, I never planned for it really unless we were having a class discussion. But how much that has impacted the vocabulary development, which we know is all part of that precursor preparatory experiences for developing phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and then phoneme grapheme correspondence. And so by not having that rich oral language environment, we're witnessing a, a, a place that act like by sure accident happened before that hasn't happened. And I think for teachers to be aware of that, but b now intentionally plan for that. So how are you incorporating oral language into your classroom environment, whether you're in kindergarten all the way up to grade 12? Like, we need to get people talking to one another. And there's something different about, like, not that we're not humans online, but physically in a space talking to each other, that seems to not connect as well when it's on a video or watching a show on TV. Like, I'm sure there's science. Mary Lou, you probably even know the science. You're all smart like that.
Well, there's certainly energies that we don't feel on Zoom the same way.
Right. And that's one of those taken for granted, I think would be the best way to describe parts that is so essential to reading that we have lost.
Absolutely. And I think it's also very difficult now in the French immersion, French second language context. It's very difficult for teachers at the best of times to incorporate that oral piece, because it is also hard to evaluate. And we know that we have certain due diligence to get marks and that kind of thing. And so it's really important to find those ways, because there are many ways, but we need that base of that oral language in every language to have that intuitive internal grammar, because that will help with our writing. We hear in our heads as we write, we correct, we self, and so there are many ways to get that oral piece brought back into the classroom. But again, there's that piece, that coming back to that systematic and explicit way. And if we can get a few group activities, games in the classroom or online, if that's where you're teaching, we can get the kids speaking again, and the learning becomes a sidebar. It's really all about the game. And why I like those games put in place is because it also it develops a huge number of competencies. It gives those kids the confidence to make mistakes. That's the biggest part for me, because it was always the game's fault, or I messed up on the rhythm, and it's not that I didn't know the answer. And so it gives students an excuse. So that's one way, bringing in these oral language games, because there's just so much. Even if you speak well, you're speaking in front of people. You might be somebody who's shy and doesn't like to speak, even though your linguistic abilities are great. And so you're bringing in all these other sort of social emotional elements as well. But one other thing I just wanted to mention on phonological awareness as well. We often think of the phonemes, and we think of the writing, the letters, but let's not forget about just listening to sound, to music, maybe even playing with the little mini instruments in the classroom where we've got 3 kids, and you turn your back and you're with 3 other kids, and they make up a little rhythm of something and you have to copy it, because that's sharpening those phonological awareness skills as well, like to have that listening going on and that repetition.
Well, and the research, I think, over and over has told us, right? The kids that have those best oral experiences, right, are introduced to many different words and lots of vocabulary, they're usually your better readers, your better writers, because the experiences and the language that they've explored with, and so many times over and over, those are your usually the stronger students in your class. And I think, again, coming off the times that we've come off of, when we've been online and our experiences maybe haven't been as intentful or as engaging because of the way and the delivery that we've had, and we've been wearing masks if we have been in person, there's a lot to be said for what I'm learning by just watching somebody in how they speak and how they form those sounds, and you know what their mouth is doing, and there's lots of learning. So I think when we talk the why, that this phonological piece has become so important, and you know, kind of why now. I think again, the time that we've come off of, the different ways that we've had to explore our language, and we haven't had that, you know, face-to-face contact in a classroom setting as much, that this is really, really an important time that we need to focus on, you know, those key phonological awareness pieces. And if we do that, and it's in that scope and sequence and within a routine and a structure, then, you know, we're increasing the chances that we're going to have those better readers and writers moving forward.
Without a doubt. And I think that the key is really, and we also have that ability with that kind of systematic approach in catching those who might be in grade 3 or 4 or 5 or beyond, and bringing them back. And the thing is if there are a few sounds that are missing, and that's all it takes sometimes to trump up your fluidity, which will, you know, bring down the ability to have a certain amount of vocabulary and comprehension. If we can get that looked at, it's a very, very short amount of time with the older grades compared to those younger ones, right? It's not like you're going to go spend a year. It might be a week or two, and then you just get that in place and they're off to the races.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important piece to highlight, because, you know, quite often as people see something like, you know, the continuum that we've thrown up on our website or whatever you're referencing, there's this moment of panic that you need to like restructure your day or ignore all your other plans, or I can't do this the way I've done it anymore. But that's the risk of the oatmeal cookie analogy, right? We're not going to get rid of one ingredient to replace the other ingredient. And that a lot of this stuff can be done in like a 10-minute window. It can be designed as, you know, part of your morning meeting. It can be designed as your transition between classes. It can be added into how you line up at the door. If you're working with older students, you can use, you know, maybe you're not looking at nursery rhymes, maybe you're looking at rap songs, or, you know, insert famous musician here. Like, I'm so out of touch, but, you know, paying attention to songs, spoken word poetry, any of those other examples where we are really highlighting all of these underlying skills around sound identification. It's not about blowing things up. It's about saying, okay, that 10 minutes where I might normally do X, for the next however many weeks, I'm going to do this instead. And in this chunk over here, I'm going to do this. And maybe, please don't send any angry emails my way. Maybe at lunchtime, I'm going to not play a movie. And I'm going to practice with my students how to make small talk.
Yeah. Well, and I think a good part of the learning is actually looking at the phonological awareness continuum, right? Having a peek at that, looking and knowing what the skills are within that, and then asking yourself as the teacher, how do these all fit into what I'm already doing, right? What have I already been doing in my classroom that hits a lot of these pieces of the continuum? And when we say continuum, it's not a linear one. So I'm not focusing on, you know, one aspect of phonological awareness. That's the beauty, I think, of phonological awareness, is that so many of the skills within it and under that umbrella intertwine and interact with each other, and you're doing multi of them every day, right? So I think it's taking some time to really reflect on all of those skills that are within that continuum and asking yourself, how do they fit in to the everyday normal stuff that I'm doing. And like you said, it's not, oodles and oodles of time. We're talking that 10, 15 minutes that I'm really going to focus on some pieces of that. And I'm going to be systematic in how I approach it. And I'm going to be routine so that the kids are seeing that skill routinely and every day and always in their face. Um, those will be the kids then that become successful with that. And that'll build that foundation that we know is going to build those strong readers and writers.
One of the teachers that I worked with just had an open house with parents. And she told me the story of a parent coming up to her and thanking her for the work that she's doing with this person's child, excuse me. And the parent had tears in his eyes, saying that he started struggling in grade 2 and it just didn't go away. So we can help those kids. And I think one of those, if we only have 10 minutes or we're not sure where to start, or we're really finding that our student just isn't understanding what they're reading, let's remember that maybe it's not about comprehension, maybe it's about sounds. And maybe start with, can my students segment? I think it's about 70 to 80, 85% of students who are in difficulty for reading cannot segment properly. Mm-hmm. So even if we start there, if we're not doing it all, can they break that apart?
Well, and I think that comes over and over again in that decoding piece, right? And we know those kids that are struggling, it's often decoding that they're having issues with. So when we talk decoding, it is being able to segment and break away those sounds, then being able to blend them and manipulate them in certain different ways, right? That's what makes those words that they're going to read in text. So if students are having difficulty being able to, isolate those sounds, segment them, and then put them together to create words, then that's a flag. That is that's a student right now that we need to be doing some extra work with, and having a look at where some of that growth needs to go with them in that skill set.
And also know that in grade 4, sort of mid-grade 4, certainly in the French context, I'm not sure about English, but that's where it starts to show up by grade 4 or 5. Mm-hmm. And again, we're at the point where we're on tier 2, tier 3 words, and they're more technological and academic, and we're moving more quickly and reading to learn rather than learning to read. And so we just need to make sure that those students can manipulate those, decode properly, and manipulate the sounds.
And I think the message needs to be that it's never too late to do that. So if you're, at the 20-minute mark, whatever we're at right now, and you're like, I have no idea what they're talking about, that's fair. Like, this might not have been covered, particularly if in your teaching experience or your training or whatever, you have focused on higher grades, and it was never really part of the foundation of your instruction, or like me, you just hope that someone ahead of you as a teacher figured that out for them, so you didn't have to worry about it. And now we're in a place where that might not have been the case, I think, for more and more teachers. I mean, we've always had kids all over the place, but I think there's definitely some highlighting going on around that space between learners and some of those missing puzzle pieces. So it's never too late to go, okay, so they've said the word grapheme phoneme correspondence 3 times already in this video, and I don't know what those words mean. As an educator, it's okay to go, okay, now I need to go figure that out. And I think sometimes we forget that we are also learners. And so the more you start to unpack and explore the world of morphology and orthography, the more you recognize the value of grapheme phoneme correspondence and what phonology brings to the table in the written English word. And so it can't be I never need to know about phonics because I don't teach the tiniest of the humans. I teach the big humans because you still need to be able to look at complex tier 2 and 3 words at high school level and understand the phonological elements inside that word. Like you have to. And so, there's many opportunities, I think, for us to know more. And I think it's also okay for us to say, I don't know that. So someone please help me with that.
And I certainly wasn't taught how to teach reading in my university degree. And when I've spoken with teachers, it's only very recently. There is a university in our province, I won't name, that just started 2 years ago to actually bring it in and start teaching within the education programming at the university. So this is something that the majority of teachers, certainly that I've dealt with and that I've read about, we don't have this experience on how do I teach even the young ones if I'm, how to teach them how to read. And so if that's the case, you're certainly not alone, and there's a lot to it. And yet it's just really important that it's not thought that, as it was thought in my day, that you come by just by osmosis. It's just you're gonna absorb the code, you're gonna absorb reading, and that you're just gonna like magically wake up one day and learn how to read. It's not the case. I certainly don't remember how I learned to read, and I think it's quite a miracle that I learned to read. I mean, it's a complex process, and it's needing to be taught, and so absolutely.
I think the other challenge, and we've talked about this amongst ourselves, is when we don't necessarily have the background knowledge, we might be in a place where we're relying on a program to guide us through a process. And let's not forget that those shiny boxes all come with promises of differences in teaching and learning that are going to happen. Otherwise, no one would buy them. And in order to do systematic instruction of any system, whether it is phonological awareness or decoding or spelling, you have to actually understand the system. And when you don't understand the system, you are forced to rely on someone else's guidance in how to navigate it. And I think that's one of those spots that many of us are in right now. We're saying, okay, you know what? Like all I know about phonics was like worksheets that haunt me from back in the day, or your readers or whatever. That's all I know about phonics. And like, I don't think that's what I want to teach. So someone needs to help me with that. And it's not helpful when, Lana and I might walk into a space and say, well, actually, there's no agreed upon scope and sequence for phonics. So you just do whatever works for you, when you don't actually know what works for you because you don't actually know, period. And so, Lana, if someone's in that spot right now, where would you guide them to go if they're like, okay, I want to be systematic, but I don't know the system yet?
We talk lots about that across the province and in our support of teachers, but I think what we've started to realize is that when you start to do the comparisons with many of the phonics programs that are out there, when you start to look at them very specifically, there's a lot of similarities, right? So I've always kind of gone with the approach that it's a great thing to bring a staff together and talk about what it is we're going to be doing and what are the skills that need to be taught. And we know we've probably got phonics programs that are on a shelf somewhere, or teachers in our school are using them. So I think it's diving into what we have and to actually look at what's in our building, sort through it and sift through it, and then come to an agreement of what is the scope and sequence, or what is the structure within what we're going to follow, and what are we going to do as a staff. So I don't think I mean, you said it perfectly. It's just not where you have to go out and spend $1,000 on a new program because we're sitting in this room saying you need a scope and sequence. It's very easy to go to Google and actually, download some phonics scope and sequence and just have a look at a few of them, because it's very similar on what phonemes would be taught first and what that progression would look like. Of course, there's variance like anything, and that's okay. But if we agree that this is what we're going to follow as a staff, and this is, the program that we're going to go with, or this is the scope that we're going to go with, is something we buy into, and we build that program within our school. And like I said, there's a lot of phonics programs that are on shelves right now that people may be using or maybe not be using. They're in the buildings, right? So I think it's opportune time to just dive in and have a little closer look, and then just come to an agreement of what that may look like in your school.
I appreciate the alignment you talked about, because I think it's really an important thing, if it can be done, that there's in French we say a suivi, like a following of an alignment across, so that those students are following into a similar understanding with the next year's teacher, and that we can support all along. And so it doesn't really matter the program that you choose to access, the understandings for your students, but that there's an alignment within the school. And I also would like to say that lucky you learning English that have a scope and sequence, which is something that there is not in French, and it is only now being very seriously looked at. I'm working on one for the province of Alberta, and it's almost finished. I'm now seeing that there's a few pockets here and there in Quebec working on them, in France, and it is complex, to say the least. And so we're putting some steps into place. And something that I'd like to know in the English context as well, if this is a situation that we were talking about decoding earlier. Now, we do a lot of phonological awareness in pre-K and K, and then you start to bring in that the sort of the phonics element in grade 1 often, or the end of kindergarten. What happens often in the French immersion situation is that we have a lot of working with sound and that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden we jump to comprehension with GB+. And those French people will know GB+. And it's meant as a comprehension series of books. They're used as readers. It's not the intent. The intent is for comprehension. There was never anything, I feel like there was this big gap between, say, kindergarten and then that sort of grade 2, 3. So for grade 1, there were never decodable readers in French. And only in the last couple of years, really year, have we seen companies start to put those together. And it's so important that the students have that, ability to read autonomously and with automaticity, and that they gain that confidence to be able to finish a book, And also we use those GB+ readers, as any teachers who might watch this know, as a sort of a testing, and just to see where they're at. But if they get to know the book so well, there's a lot of guessing going on, and they reread those books, and so it's not a true understanding of their comprehension.
And I think one of the things with the decodable readers too is that what we find in English, not all kids will require decodable text. There will be kids in your classroom that, understand that phonological awareness really, really well. They get the phonics stuff. It becomes easy. They're able to blend, segment sound, and put words together, and they just seem to get it. So there will be many kids that won't require decodable text. But what we find is those kids struggling, the ones that are really having the hardship of segmenting those sounds or those phonemes, and then blending them and ripping them apart, and now manipulating them and putting them into different spaces. Those kids tend to be the ones that require that decodable text, where those phonicsy type lessons that we're working with them on now transfer into that continuous text that you would see in a book, right? So there's kind of a meld there. So any of those kids that are struggling, it is a big advantage to have decodable text in your classrooms, in your school, and have those kids identified, because there's that intervention piece that you can use to help and support them phonetically, so that they, grasp that skill a little bit better.
I think the other thing to point out with decodable readers is I read a small Twitter thread horror story where kids are being told that if they have if they're reading now, they shouldn't look at the pictures because that's cheating, and they should just be sounding out the words. can we all just agree that all the parts on the page are fair game to build meaning? And, you know, even we, when we're flipping through a magazine or learning about something new, are going to rely on things beyond the text in order for us to make meaning and understanding in reading. So while it may be decodable, you can also be leveraging some of those, let's call them chocolate chip strategies, to help you understand the text. You know, it all just comes together, and I don't know why we feel the need to create binaries as humans.
There are other strategies. If we don't want the images, there are other tools. But let's not discount the images when they are there.
Right.
So there are multiple tools at our disposal.